Association Cyprus, welcome. Firstly, we would like to extend our thanks to KPMG, our sponsors, for hosting this event. Thank you. And we would also like to express our thanks to all our LSE alumni and friends for honoring us with your presence and making this event a success. Before introducing tonight's panel, a few quick words on who we are. We estimate the Cypriot LSE community, alumni, students, Nobel Prize winners, Olympic athletes, to consist of about 1,000 people from all walks of life. A notable cluster of talented individuals spanning diverse industries, career levels, and age groups. As an association, our main objective includes bringing our alumni together and fostering the sharing of ideas, knowledge, and expertise from the LSE and among all LSE stakeholders, over coffee, over drinks and bites. By promoting active alumni engagement, our aim is to keep you interested and inspired. On that note, we have more events organized for the near future. With that in mind, it is such a great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel for this evening, all LSE alumni who bring a wealth of diverse experience and intriguing insight to this discussion. While each one has an impressive list of credentials, I will summarize just one line. Demetris Georgiades will be our panel moderator. Demetris is an active member of the Alumni Association Committee for many years and currently chairman of the Cyprus Economy and Competitiveness Council. Anna Koukkides-Procopiou is the president of the POLITIA think tank and former Minister of Justice and Public Order. Constantinos Petrides, former Minister of Finance, former Minister of Interior. And our two panelists who will be joining us virtually from the UK. Gregoris Ioannou will be joining us from the Manchester Metropolitan University, where he is currently a reader, associate professor. And last but not least, Vassilis Monastiriotis, who will be joining us from the London School of Economics. Vassilis is the director of the Hellenic Observatory Center, also professor of political economy. Ladies and gentlemen, Demetris. Oh, and this panel is being recorded.
Thank you, Eleni, for the introduction. Dear alumni, friends and speakers, welcome to this event that hopefully will evolve into an interesting and heated debate. What a day to have this debate. First of all, allow me to share a screen with you. Today, as you are probably all aware, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences have awarded the Nobel for Economics to 3 economists, and their press release that accompanied their announcement stated that they have helped us understand differences in prosperity between nations. A Nobel that clearly relates to our topic today. While much attention has been given to the rise of political extremism in many countries, growing concerns over issues such as income inequality and poverty, often attributed to the limitations of free market capitalism, have brought changes and political shifts all over the world, as we have seen in France and the UK. This dynamic and contrasting panel discussion will delve into these causes and consequences of this phenomenon. Is the failure of democracy causing the rise of leftism and rightism? Can the current system be overhauled, or do we need a completely new form of political and economic governance? These are some of the questions we'll address today. First of all, let's start with some logistics. As Eleni said, the event will be recorded, and will be made available to our members. So if someone does not want to have the privilege to show off at such a privileged event, please let us know, and we throw you out of the room. The intention is to have a debate, so we don't have formal presentation and discussions. What we'll do, we'll give each of our speakers 5 minutes for a brief introduction. Then I'll take advantage of my position for a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor from discussion. I do appreciate that the nature of this topic is such that most of us will want not just to ask questions, but also to make statements. So please remain within the boundaries of the topic and as short as possible. Without further ado, I ask our panelists, our discussants, to take off their glasses and their gloves, and let's start this virtual fair. Eleni gave me strict instructions on the sequence to follow. So we'll start first with Vassilis Monastiriotis, please. Professor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. First of all, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Yes. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm in this dual position of being both alumnus of the LSE but also staff member of the LSE, so I've never left the school. Thank you for this very nice event and the opportunity to participate, even though I cannot be physically with you. I want to raise a couple of opening points, and of course we're going to get back to the discussion to elaborate more. The first one I want to make is that actually, it doesn't go nicely with the title of the event, but inequality has not increased significantly. The phenomena, the political and social phenomena that we see that we want to discuss today are not really correlating with the observable rise in inequality. I want to mention a very recent, just this summer, study by the Eurofound, which is the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, which monitors both employment relations but also very much income inequalities and welfare standards across the European Union. It's an organization of the European Union. And a recent study just published in July makes really the case that the overall inequalities between the good years before the Eurozone and the global financial crisis, between 2006 and just after COVID, inequalities have not increased significantly. Yes, they went up a bit in some countries, went down a bit in some other countries, in Europe, of course. What happened is that we do have a middle class squeeze, so we have more people, escaping at the top and a more sizable percentage of people escaping at the bottom, but the overall inequality has not increased. It is just that people are now more exposed to the extremes, and if you want, in that sense, not only relative poverty has increased, so the level of poverty, absolute poverty has not actually increased significantly, but relative poverty has increased significantly, so we see this rise of the extremes, if you want. And in that sense, also what has increased is that the inequality has become more visible. If nobody is in the middle, then the people you look at are either kind of below you or above you. The inequalities are much more visible. But statistically, if you want, in terms of numbers, inequalities have not increased. Now, this is the point one that I want to make. The other point then is what is the thing that could be related to the two issues of extremism, political disenfranchisement, and so forth. And I want to propose something which is kind of alluded to in the literature, but is not really explicitly developed in the literature. The literature does talk about the cultural shift, if you want, that we have a shift from kind of economic concerns into cultural concerns. There's people both in the working class that are for and against, for example, migration or LGBTQ issues, gender identity issues, and also people at the top or in the traditional right wing that would be both for and against these issues. So there's basically a cultural shift that creates new cleavages in a different dimension than the economic. That's what the literature is. I would like to propose actually that a significant thing that creates this confusion and this difficulty in public perceptions that lead then to extremism and the rise of populism and so forth, is that we have lost some very important constants. Now, what are the constants in our societies? One is definitely religion, you know, the faith, the belief in probably the afterlife or in some power that would correct the wrongdoings of this world is a very powerful institution, if you will, that keeps people in a particular path. Likewise, in previous decades, for some people, not very religious, I imagine, what was promised by socialism and communism and the Eastern Bloc was also something that kept people at bay. You know, there was a future life where things would be corrected, there was something to hope for. I think another thing that we can relate to is more traditionalist, is the role of the family. You know, it was the family, either at the micro level, you know, the father and the mother and the uncle, or as an institution more generally that kept people, kept behaviors in a particular segment, you know, in a particular range. And I think all of these things have now become less influential, less important. Definitely the second one, you know, communism has really all but disappeared. So I think that unleashes in a way, you know, think about some sort of chemical reaction that unleashes ions and protons, and they can go in any direction. And that's why we see this kind of anarchy, you know, of people moving from the very left to the very right, or from regressive positions to progressive positions, and obviously much more on the other direction, from progressive positions to more regressive positions. Anti-migration, anti-gender rights, identity rights, and so forth. So I think what we see is not so much related to inequality, but is related to losing out constants, whether these constants were economic, you know, working class versus upper class or whatever it is, or the bourgeoisie or whatever, whether it is that constant or a constant in a more institutional sense, religion, family, you know, grand politics. I will leave it to that. I obviously have a few more things to say, but I hope that kind of allows the discussion to open, and happy to hear where the discussion takes us.
Okay, thank you, Professor Monastiriotis. We'll now go down to Ioannou.
Well, I mean, the definition we've, the very title and the description of this event sort of drives towards the economic. And this is what Mr. Monastiriotis has been discussing. The economic becomes political, but it's been political all along. That's my take. And when we are examining the rise of the left, of the extreme left, as we've said, or the extreme right, I do not think there are some common denominators, but there are differences as well. And there is a famous horseshoe approach, where we present the political spectrum not as a straight line, but as a horseshoe, where the one end and the other end are very close together. But I do not think that is really the case. Let me explain what I mean. There is a commonality in that both the left parties, let's say the Social Democrats, and the traditional conservative parties have diluted their positions. And they have tried to move to the center where they become quite similar to one another. And let me explain what I mean. I mean, as far as the traditional conservative, traditional parties as are concerned, we've seen them that they moved away from the constants that have just been discussed to, let's say, more progressive ideas. Now, it seems that electorate hasn't moved with them. The electorate likes to hang on to traditional values, whether it's religion, whether it's the family, whether it's conserving our culture and not allowing foreigners to sort of taint it with their intervention in our way of life. So the leaderships have tried to be more progressive, but the electorate won't have it. And it's the same on the left. The leadership of let's say, the socialist parties or the social democrat parties have tried to move towards the center. And there was a big question among the left, how much of a left government was Tony Blair's government? How much of a leftist government is Keir Starmer's government? So we see that the electorate is staying at the ends, and the leadership is trying to take them somewhere where they don't want to be. And that allows for a vacuum. And when you have someone who's clever enough to capitalize on that fear of the unknown, someone who wants hope, and this is what nature is all about, it's very easy to use methods which will take advantage of that gap between leadership and voters. Now, the extreme right uses different methods from the extreme left. The extreme right, and it's been the same since Hitler's time, they use fringe issues which are close to one's heart, to the community. We've seen Thraciavi in Greece, helping the old ladies take their groceries home and cash their pension check at the bank without being robbed by these immigrants who are a threat, etc., etc. These policies have been used and are being used by the extreme right all along, everywhere in Europe, I would say. Whereas on the other hand, whereas the extreme right focuses on this kind of issues and tries to make them quite relevant, the left looks at the very big picture and promises a future, a vision, which is yet to come. And of course, let's say, not the extreme left, leftist ideology is about linear progression. We're moving towards an end, yes? This is what Marx was talking about if we refer to Marx. We don't see that teleological concept being present in extreme right ideologies. Now, at the same time, because of what is going on around us, and just have one look at the internet and social media, and we see truthism taking over. And what do I mean by truthism? Is this what we as humans try to hold on to, even though we know facts tell us not to. So half-truths, fake news, distorted pieces of information. I mean, Trump is running a whole campaign on this. So everything around us is changing with an exponential rate of growth. And we're not able, I think, as voters, as citizens, to grasp exactly what is going on. So we don't know how to save ourselves. And this is human nature. We're looking for someone to save us. And I've seen this I've seen this everywhere. I mean, everywhere. In cases where you examine how the electorate behaves, they either vote for someone who will save them, who is a homemaker, or they're voting to oust someone else. So, which are very interesting patterns, I think, in having the electorate making, let's say, unusual choices in some cases, as we have had with Phidias, for example, that they were voting to punish someone, to oust someone, without really having something solid to hold on. So we have paradoxes and contradictions in behavior. So in my mind, it is very, very difficult to pinpoint a reason for what is going on as one reason alone. But in my mind, it's not economic. The economic side of it is a catalyst, but in my mind, the answer to this is political. So I'll stop. Okay.
That's it. Thank you, Anna. So far, two speakers mentioned religion, family, and cultural issues. Let's see what our next speakers will concentrate on. Now we move to Gregoris Ioannou from Manchester University. Gregoris, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. I have a few points to make. I largely agree with what Vassilis Monastiriotis said, and to some extent also with Procopiou, but I want to change the frame a bit. So the first point is about the inequality and the poverty. So there is no significant rise in inequality. Vassilis said that there's some rise in relative poverty, but not great enough to explain that. Well, there is no mechanical connection that leads from the economic developments into the political development. Obviously, the two realms are united, but there's no automatic transition or automatic translation of economic conditions into political upheavals. So I think that I agree that the issues that we should look at the issues a bit elsewhere than the economy per se. Although the economy is always relevant, and there are specific points where the developments in the economy have opened up a series of issues. So, a comment on the title and on the frame of this event. So, the rise of the extremism, or the extreme left and the extreme right. I think there's no equivalence here. There is no rise of extreme left. There is a rise of extreme right, but there is no rise of extreme left. If you see what goes on as what passes on as left or far left today, is basic social democracy. Jeremy Corbyn's in the UK or the French left and so on do not have any demands or any positions that are in any way radical or extreme. It's things that in the 80s would pass for a very mainstream policy of redistribution. So there is no rise on the far left. There's just a discontent with the framework of policy, the dominant framework of policy. And I believe that the problem, the crisis that we face, and we can call it the crisis of democracy, has to do with with issues such as the erosion of institutions, the erosion of representativeness, the distancing of politicians from the electorate, and the decreasing scope of politics itself. So the fact that we call what in the 80s would pass as standard social democratic policy as something far left today is one example of that, of how narrow the scope of permissible politics has become. And we can see that also with in terms of the technocratic imposition or the technocratic constraints, where different decisions that are political, are about resources, are about planning, are delegated into technocrats, and they are not part of the political debate. This process has reached its peak, I think, in the economic crisis, the financial crisis a decade ago, where it was saying that you cannot do this because the markets the financial markets put the constraints, you're not allowed to do that, you're not allowed to do the other. So there was this understanding that the politics is not open, is not about decisions, is not about different alternatives. It's just about people taking the decisions that are imposed by technocrats and the markets. So that's the first point. Now, Vassilis mentioned the absence of constants, like the family and so. I would add some others who also might have an economic element. The rise of, the absence of the belief in upward social mobility, or the absence in the belief of a stable employment and stable career for many people, especially the younger generation. Because they see that what is ahead of, what is in front of them, was in front of many of them, many of young graduates, from school or university that ahead of it there is no smooth career prospects as they might have existed or to some extent existed in the previous generation. So that's again a constant that is absent, and that has a more direct relation with the economy. And the final point I want to make is about the changing of the dominant ideology, if you like. Since the 80s, we operate, at least in Europe, in Western Europe, we operate under the framework of neoliberalism. That has become the sort of mainstream, policy framework, the universe in which any politics takes place. And there was, in the 80s and the 90s, belief in that there was, the societies were buying into that. We see that being less the case today. Neoliberalism has been undermined. It's still dominant in terms of policy, but it's not as dominant as it was in terms of as an ideology. So there is less consent today, and this absence of consent is usually compensated with more authoritarianism and more coercion. I have a point about the far right. I believe that the rise of the far right is a reaction to that. The far right takes some elements from the what used to be the social democratic tradition about welfare and about some sort of redistribution, but then instead of asking those set of policies from the elite, from the state, it basically, or to target the ruling class or the dominant class, it targets the class that is at the bottom of society, the class of poor migrants that are considered to be to blame for this loss of community welfare and so on. And the point is not that I would disagree a bit with the point that Anna made that there is a shift of the leaderships to the center. That's the case with the left for sure, but in terms of the right, I would say, or the far right, I would say that what we see is that the dominant policy framework has shifted as a whole to the right. So the reason why today a mere social democratic redistribution demand appears as far left, there's a parallel to that a racist policy today does not appear immediately as a racist policy because it is voiced by European Union leaders, because it is voiced by moderate rights, by liberals, even in the political sphere. So to have a normalization of xenophobia to some extent, and a normalization of targeting of migrants. So I would say that's the opposite actually. So it's the fact that there's a shift, a drift to the right that strengthens and legitimizes far right, and obviously skillful leaders in the far right can make use of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ioannou. I guess the shift of the left to the right is because the right is right, but we can discuss it later. Sorry?
Just to clarify to what Luciana has just said, what I meant was that the leaderships moved to be more progressive. The electorate didn't follow. And now obviously that is seen as someone else is hijacking those traditional conservative right-wing values. They're moving. I absolutely agree with you. And what happened today, for example, in Poland, Tusk, of all people, said we will no longer examine asylum applications. And I mean, he's been heading the European Union in the past, and he's not that kind of person, but, well, guess what? He's got elections coming up. So I think that's one example. So we are in total agreement with Gregoris. This is what I just wanted to maybe, just in, maybe I didn't clarify myself before.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And last but not least, Constantinos.
I don't know where to start from. I will start by self-identifying myself in the political spectrum. And this has something to do with what was said before. I'm an economic liberal and social conservative. Now, 15 years ago, had I been asked the same question, I would identify myself as economic liberal and social liberal. The thing is that I have not moved in my positions. I believed the same then, and I believe the same now. The difference in this self-identification, I believe, is that the shift has been to the left of both political parties, but also in the thinking of many people. And this creates a gap. And I am able to prove that with data and with surveys. Nevertheless, talking about capitalism and about the rise or decrease of poverty, I mean, anybody who studied or could read some journals, there is overwhelming evidence about the correlation with free markets, open trade, and the decrease of poverty. Very recently, I was reading some statistics from the World Bank and the WTO about absolute poverty in absolute correlation with the increase of international trade, going down from 40% poverty in 1980 to 28% in 2000 to 10% in 2010 and to 8% in 2022, with the respective increases in the global trade values. There is a lot of literature, if you take a more static view, there is a lot of literature about the benefits to the consumer, the increase of the purchasing power because of the EU unification, the common market, the single market. I was teaching about a course at the university a few months ago. The protection before we entered the EU equal to around 300% in most products. There was a huge welfare loss to the society because of this protection. Was it capitalism and free markets that liberated this process? Yes. And without the industry being destroyed, maybe making some shifts. Let's also take what we like talking about inequality. First of all, I'm not a big, I don't admire too much the discussion about equality and inequality, because we could all be equal but poor, and we could all be better off in a non-so-equal society, as it happens. And within capitalism, of course, nobody is going to have equality of income. But let's see those social indicators. If you take the Gini coefficient, you see the lowest Gini coefficient in the countries, in the most open markets. So there is a correlation between capitalism, if we could call it capitalism, and the decrease of inequality. In Cyprus, for example, in the past 10 years, what is the perception? The perception is that inequality has risen. Inequality has risen, yeah? Okay, the actual facts show the opposite. Gini coefficient has been decreased to 0.29%, to 0.29, which is quite low. And the S80, S20 indicator, which is the share of income of the richest 20% of the population in relation to the poorest 20% of the population, decreased from 5 to 4.1. So actual data proves the opposite. And I would say that we don't live in a capitalistic society. We live in democratic capitalism. I don't.
Constantinos, Petrides, η ΑΚΠ.
No, I would say that the post-war model followed, which was democratic capitalism, has nothing to do with pure capitalism, but it has a heavy state intervention. I don't know in which capitalistic society the government intervention amounts to about 50% of the economy or 40% of the economy, and that was in order to bring social benefits to the society. So it was a kind of compromise in the post-war era, and it was not brought by social democrats. It was actually the CDU and the Christian Democrats who brought this model to Europe. Now, regarding extremism, I'm going to be very quick because I will stick to my 5 minutes. I would say that, I would only say that when we talk about extremism, we have to have a clear definition of what extremism constitutes and how it differentiates this extremism from healthy right-wing politics. And allow me to say that not everything beyond the left is extremism. Thank you.
Thank you, Constantinos. Interesting. Let me start this discussion by sharing those slides. Where is it? To be honest, I had my doubts when I also wrote the title, whether income equality is a source of this issue. This is one of the most famous persons that took part in the Capitol Hill during previous elections in the US. A millionaire got arrested. So there was no income issue here. But what was more interesting is what two police officers that involved in domestic violences and extremism issues identified as the key issues. What they argued is that what leads to extremism, it's not ideological issues anymore. The younger generation is fascinated for violence and causing all these issues. I want to go back to Professor Monastiriotis, who mentioned that the religion is becoming weaker, family bonds are becoming weaker, but still, I'm not sure whether this is the issue, because when we look at Scandinavian countries, I think that they're amongst the less religious nations, couples stop getting married, so is it something deeper than that?
I used to know very little about the Nordic countries, but I'm now married to a Norwegian, so I cannot claim not to know a lot. Although she would correctly tell me that Norway is not Scandinavian, but I think the loss of constance is universal, and of course we will have differences. You know, of course, traditionalism, traditional family relations are, more important in rural Brazil, if you want, than in Manhattan and New York. But the decline is more secular. I want to go back to that one point of the last slide that you showed, and this kind of the reference to fascination with violence. I think people who have some experience or knowledge of the youth movements, maybe in the university, in the 80s, and of course before and probably in the 90s, they would know that there were a lot of people who would identify with what we call today extreme political left. But many of them, soon after they finish university, they would graduate and start families and start looking for jobs, careers, and so forth. So it has always been that, you know, the political extremism was not only ideological. There were some people who were very invested ideologically into the extreme left, and in previous times, I would say also the extreme right. But a lot of the people that populated these movements were really young people who were really, at the end of the day, fascinated with, maybe not fascinated with violence, but, you know, so that they needed to, you know, to direct their adrenaline somewhere. And that's why, you know, only few people remain in these kind of movements, both in the right and in the left, after the, let's say, mid-20s. So that's on the point of the fascination. I would like also to say something about that discussion we had. I mean, I didn't try to say where politics moved, but all the other speakers moved to, you know, talked about move to the center, move to the left, move to the right. So I would like to engage a bit with that, if I may. So there is something to be said about the complexity of issues. You know, because of technology, because of globalization, because of all the crises we have, pandemics, climate change, things, topics, issues, policy decisions have become much more complex. You know, we don't have closed borders, capital controls, where the policy decision on the macroeconomic is, you know, do I increase my money supply, or do I raise my interest rates, or what do I do? Now it is much more complex. You know, you have to deal with what happens with the, you know, hyper-financialization, with the fast-moving financial capital. You have to understand what happens with the supply chains. You know, in a pandemic, I may not have protective equipment, so I need to have good geopolitics in order to be able to have access to different resources. Things are just much more complex. I mean, we see it with our students, much more difficult to explain to our students what actually happens in reality. And the reason why the politics have, you know, Demetris Procopiou said that politics move to the center, is that because you need more professionalized governance. So, you know, you can be serious in opposition and be very left-wing, but when you move to government, you will become a bit more pragmatic because it's a difficult issue to deal with. And I think we'll see it, you know, if Marine Le Pen ever makes it, you know, to government in France, she will, you know, we saw it with Italy. You have to be more pragmatic once in power. Things are complex. It's easy on the position to say, oh, I have the solution, it's a one-line solution, but when you're in government, it's more difficult. So there is that. On the other hand, we can see that there's both a shift to the left and the right. You know, we had introduction of the minimum wage, for example, also more recently in Cyprus, a few years back in Greece, many, you know, in Germany, and so forth. Some say this is a neoliberal thing, you know, it destabilizes trade unions. On the other hand, you see that right-wing governments, or Christian democratic governments, introduced and increased the minimum wage quite significantly. So it is also, you can look at this and say, well, look, the center right is moving to the left, it's becoming more left-wing. So what I want to say is that there's all movements on all directions, and that's why it is also difficult to pinpoint if it's a move to the left or a move to the right. But I will stick, I like to point about the economic constants like stable employment and this kind of you know, promise of upward mobility that Professor Ioannou mentioned. I would still stick to this idea about, like, you know, the lost constants create, you know, all this movement in different directions.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to another slide. And if any of the speakers want to intervene or add something, please interrupt me. Okay, there's one libertarian known professor, one more leftist. They both argue that Friedrich Hayek says that democracy and socialism are not compatible. A left professor claims that capitalism and democracy are not compatible. We've heard Ioannou arguing that leaders want to progress, want to promote change, but the voters, the citizens don't follow them. So my question is democracy the issue?
No, democracy is not the issue, it's never been the issue. I mean, democracy has been around for thousands of years. In different forms, but it's been around. Obviously, we shouldn't be taking it for granted in the form that we think this is democracy and this is how it is. But history moves in cycles, and inequality has always existed. If we, if you think about ancient Athens, that I see people, who idolize it and idealize it. A city run by slaves, an empire attacking and annihilating its enemies to the ground, a great place of inequality. Rome, I mean, wasn't there capitalism in Rome? If we think of capitalism in a different sense, you have the very rich and the very poor, and the proletarians who had nothing to lose but their chains, as Marx said, who studied Rome very, very carefully. In my mind, because I'm a historian originally by training, I don't see many changes in these forms that people decided to organize themselves. What I think has changed, now Hayek was of course Thatcher's favorite economist of all times. And the association of Hayek and Friedman, and then Naomi Klein's doctrine of shock, they were these technocrats sent in by governments to destroy economies and take over them. It's one way of seeing the world around us. But I say the world was always like that. And we like to sort of, we point a lot on equality and inequality, but I think there is one key word we have been missing as far as terrorism is concerned, as far as juvenile crime is concerned, as far as migrants are concerned. And I don't think it's just a matter of the haves and the have-nots, it's a matter of inclusion. We don't really talk about inclusion. And what is inclusion? And we always say, there's a famous saying, diversity is inviting lots of people to the party with you. And capitalism invites everyone to the party. That's the sort of basic premise behind it. But who gets to dance? If people don't get to dance at our democratic capitalistic party, then they may want to deviate from it and deviate from the norms of it. And we see this with terrorism, for example, when you look into societies where you have even second and third generation migrants, and they decide to go against the society which has, they were born and bred in it. Why do they want to spread terror? Why don't they adhere to the values? They've never been invited to dance in this party. So it's all, it's complicated. And I don't think you can just easily say equality, income, democracy, capitalism, bad, good. I mean, just to pose one last word for thought, the MENA region, where actually geographically we are based, is the only region where income levels are going down. And it's the region which has 5% of the population, I think, of this planet, and has 15% of conflict. So democracy is very relevant. This is a very Western discussion we're having. And we're not thinking about what is going on next door, which is the Middle East and North Africa. And I just wanted to mention it because I think, I feel really awkward that we only care about what is going on in the West. But the Middle East is, and there is no democracy there, and maybe can never be.
Thank you, Anna. Now let me open the floor for discussion. Please state your name.
Hi, my name is Alexander Apostolidis. This question is for Ms. Anna Koukkides-Procopiou. It's about legitimizing extremism while in government. So on the 8th of August 2023, the title of the Israeli daily I-24 said, Ben-Gvir holds first meeting with EU Minister Anna Koukkides-Procopiou. The meeting between controversial Israeli minister and his Cypriot counterpart marks the first ever meeting between Ben-Gvir and European minister. Ben-Gvir was convicted of terrorism by the Israeli state in 2007. So I would like to know whether that was done under your initiative or under you were asked by someone to do that, because we're talking about terrorism. You are the only European minister who saw a convicted terrorism and took a picture with him. Thank you.
The guy was my counterpart. I don't get to choose ministers. I got to sit next to ministers, which I will not name, whose ideas while we were having lunch at EU Council of Ministers meeting were despicable. And I would have never chosen to sit next to them or even talk to them, but I had to, because that was my job. Now, Ben-Gvir, Cyprus was burning. He sent us his crews, okay, and his helicopters and his planes to put out the fires. He was here on holiday. He said, I want to come and see my crews, which you had just sent to help us. So, no, please, let me finish, Alex. Let me finish.
I think it's not a fair question.
Okay, it's not a fair question because I'm not sure as a former government minister, but I will stand by my decision and my government's decision, because I will not point out who said who to whom. I will not expose anyone about making decisions, but I duly say that no minister ever gets to choose their counterparts. So if a government is a friendly government and a government has assisted you, you have the duty and the responsibility to put aside your personal feelings and convictions, as long as you're part of the government, you represent the government, and choices are made by that.
Sorry. Anyway, please stick to the topic.
The topic is extremism. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's not personal.
It's not a personal attack. He's a minister, so he's not extremist because he's a minister? Sorry, we're talking about extremism, right wing and left wing. I understand that.
Alex, you made your point.
Can we not talk about an extremist government? Is extremist only outside government? Because I fully understand I will be outside the topic. If not talking
please,
about
the issue here is not, to me, to criticize a politician.
I didn't criticize anyone. Right?
Here, please, next question.
Okay, I'm Maria Afterlecha, and I wanted to agree with the idea that a lot of constants are missing and they have changed. But I think technology has a huge part to play in all of these changes, because before we had the constants and they were up here and the people were down here and they were looking and they were reading, but they didn't have an actual reach to politicians, to economists, to the political parties. So right now, it's like there's lack of respect for everything, because you can criticize anybody on social media. You can criticize, or you can love or hate somebody. You can change your mind the next day and the next minute. And this has created changes in the mindset of people. And you can see the huge difference in Gen Z. They behave very differently than even the millennials, let alone the Generation X, that probably most of us are part of the Generation X. So I wanted to focus a little bit on why and how technology is not making justice to the people. And it's like people have fallen behind and we're not educated enough about technology. We don't behave in the right way anymore. Anybody who can answer me could this question.
Anyone from speakers?
You have sociologists. They should take the.
Someone from the UK? Yes?
I could say something. Obviously, we know that, social media is a big part of the problem of half-truths or, circulation of lies and so forth, fake news. And so we know this is a problem. In a way, in a funny way, this idea that the internet will democratize knowledge, so knowledge will not be only the prerogative of the experts, but it will be accessible to the masses, and then people have more information, will be able to make more informed decisions, to increase the accountability of the expert decisions because you can collect this information. All this is then back to our faces, because obviously one way of devaluing knowledge is by putting out there so much information that it becomes unmanageable. It's impossible to go through all the information and to assess it. So then one of the effects of that is that people go to the comfort zone, and everybody's agreeing with a small group of friends on Facebook or TikTok or whatever else, and everybody else is demonized. And I think this is something that has been well understood in academic inquiry, both in politics and in political science and in other fields. So of course this is a problem with information, but I would still go back to say that what is really missing here is that kind of the framework that will keep people into a particular set of behaviors, and this is my reference to Constance again. Again, as to say that if decisions were easier to explain, if the problems were easier to deal with, it would be easier also for the politicians to communicate the choices. So it is the complexity of the issues, I think, that is the paramount thing. But on the whole, of course, I fully agree that this proliferation of information without being able to assess the information is a big part of the problem.
Gregoris, Ioannou, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, I just want to make the point that technology is a factor that we need to take into account when we analyze contemporary society, obviously, and different political reactions. But I don't think it can explain the content. It cannot. It's a tool. It's a tool that is widely available with its benefits and its downsides and so on. But I don't think it can really tell us where things are going, or whether in a positive or in a negative way. I don't think that the relationship between people and politics, the idea of politics and political view changes because of digital technology and social media. I want to go back to a point made earlier, I think, by Constantinos, Petrides, on the shift to the right and the shift to the left. And I would agree to some extent with that. On some respects, I think there has been a shift to the left in terms of, for example, social identities and sexuality and human rights to some extent. But I will stick to my point and return to the idea that there are at least a couple of issues that are very central in which it is the right, there's a shift to the right, in the sense that the right wing or the far right has managed in the last decades to shape the agenda. And migration is one of them, but it's not the only one. We can also see, for example, the decline of trade unions. That's a historical process. It's not something that happens today. It's something that happened over many decades, since the 60s and 70s. Compare today, trade union membership and so on, it's much lower. This has a direct impact on how people, citizens experience collective organizations and experience ultimately politics. Because there was a term, especially in Europe, in Central Europe, of industrial citizenship that was describing this idea of belonging and that of this dialogue, social dialogue happening through collective bargaining institutions and co-determining terms and conditions of employment. This has been eroded, is here, and overall there's a shift in the balance of power that happens at the level of labor. And you can see the reflection of that also on labor law. Labor law has shrunk, it has been individualist, it has shifted. All the legislation that it has expanded in terms of volume, but in terms of substance, it has shrunk. And it's all about individual rights, which are difficult to enforce, because it's not easy to go to court against your employer for the majority of the people. And that's the basic protections that exist. This wasn't the case in Europe in the 50s, the 60s, and up to the 70s. So these are elements which show historical change that I argue is to the right, because it has eroded collective processes and has strengthened individual and individualistic processes, managerialism at the level of the workplace, but also at the level individualism at the level of the law.
Thank you.
Can I say something about technology?
Just one thought. I mean, when we analyze forms of power, a very, very new term we use in international relations is sharp power. We talk about hard power, and I think you all know what it is, and we talk about soft power, and I'm sure you know what it is, and then we talk about smart power, which is a combination of the two. But very recently, we started examining what we see as sharp power, which is the ability of one society to infiltrate another. What about Cambridge Analytica? What about paying for all these websites supporting Le Pen in France? Can we rig elections from afar? Could we have done it before? Can we manipulate public opinion from afar? What about malign foreign influence? If we see, I was involved in a very interesting research a few years back, and we're seeing the Chinese, very good at it, infiltrating public opinion in Greece and Cyprus and the rest of Europe. And the indicators were going up year after year. So what we think as voters about things that matter in our home, and we think we're voting independently about issues at home, maybe they have been projected onto us by some other forces. So I think it's something we really need to think about.
Very scary. I think one way to measure whether we move to the left or to the right is the measure of government, tax burden, which is at a long-time high. So maybe it's too simplistic anyway.
Thank you, Artemis Artemiou. I would like to hear a little bit more about immigration. I mean, it's been a major issue in the American elections and also in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit more? What are your views on this? I mean, I want to hear a little bit more. We haven't touched it in depth. Thank you.
In my original intervention, I said that we have to define what extremism is. I think in regards to migration, we have been considering anybody who believes in the protection of borders into strict laws against illegal migration. The left portrays them as fascists, as extremists. No. And in this way, they are whitewashing the real extremists. Are 22% of Swedish people who voted right beyond the EPP extremists? Did 41% of the French people, educated, socially sensitive, became extremists? Are we fair to them? Do we have to reconsider some of our rhetoric? Or do we have to follow and be entrapped into the leftist rhetoric that everything beyond the left is racism? I do believe in strict migration policies. I have not heard anybody from the left to reassess all these policies following the past 50 or 60 years about integration and whether they have worked, or whether the second or third generation of certain cultures of immigrants are even more extremist than the first generation. These are real issues. By just calling everybody xenophobes, racists, I think we're missing the point. And that's why any kind of debate will be relevant, because we live in a little cloud. I think I made myself clear.
Other speakers or next question?
Thank you. Well, I have a few points to make. Once we have in Europe, for instance, parties which are extreme, getting 30% of the votes, and Le Pen getting 37 in France, then the question is, what's the extreme and what's the mainstream? There's kind of confusion there. The second point is that I agree that mostly what's causing populism is cultural insecurity. The loss of constance, I would call it security of culture, immigration, and all of these things. But on economic equality, I think the numbers around the meeting are wrong. There is a problem with economic equality, it is quite high, and it takes the reformers, and it's part of the problem, and part of the equation. It may not be the first one, but it's very important. For instance, in this country, Cyprus, when income allocation changed from 50% to wage in 28 to 40%, that's economic equality. When a house now costs 15 times per capita income, or average income, than 5 or 7 times per capita income 10, 15 years ago, that's economic equality. What's left for me to spend, or for the average person to spend, it's the income he or she receives, less tax, and less the housing expense. If the housing expense is so high because of housing inflation, the asset inflation we've seen in the past 50 years, that's economic equality. It's important. It's exclusion, right? It's an issue. Now, the last point to make is the European Union as such. Following the 2024 expansion, following the enlargements, following this great number of countries being members of it, it's become very bureaucratic. And this causes alienation. And perhaps the question is, to what extent all this populism, right, that we see in Europe in particular, derives from this drive in Europe for integration and bureaucracy at the European Commission, right, which is becoming very flamboyant in recent debates.
You're right. There is a very good book, The Bonfire of the European Bureaucracy, from an MP, an insider, who was chef de cabinet, also a commissioner. And he's claiming that the EU resembles more and more totalitarian regimes that lost actually touch with the ground, with the market, with the people, and they think that will save the world. This bureaucracy you are talking about, okay, there is one principle, the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is that the EU takes decisions and policies only if it's necessary at the top level. Decisions should be made at the national level, even on local level. This has been violated for 20, for 30 years right now. And it's been violated more and more after Delors. After Delors, the European Union, who started as a conservative experiment of a free market, of free market, of doing away with boundaries, of creating a single market, of having the four freedoms, became a socialist experiment. Too bureaucratic. I don't know if you ever read about the very famous regulation of the curved cucumber. About having a regulation, how curved could a cucumber be to be allowed to be marketed as a cucumber. I mean, they are intervening in everything, in every way of life, in the social market as well. Now they want to introduce a minimum wage at the European level. At the European level. Where does the principle of subsidiarity goes? So yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think that's one of the big problems, that people are turning away from the European Union that brought peace and stability and prosperity for so many years, and they don't realize it. So I agree.
But whose responsibility is that? I hate this argument about the tyranny of the technocrats. And there's books being written about it, and also it includes not the UN, and so on and so forth. But who's responsible for it? Where's leadership? These are,
The Commission is responsible.
Well, I mean, there's someone who should be, on top of things, and that's the leaders. That's the
Talking
leaders.
about democracy, where is the democratic legitimacy of the European Commission? Who is taking all the rights of initiative for every policy?
Well, they don't take initiatives without
what?
Consultation with governments for the big issues. You know that. I mean, they don't just wake up one day and they come up with a
They have the sole
big...
right of initiative.
Yes, but they
sometimes
they
are
do.
blocked by the...
Yeah, okay. They come up with ideas, but also they bring to the table ideas that are initiated by governments who make them.
By the Commission.
Okay, strictly speaking, yes, but this is not good for it. I disagree with you. And I think there should be a responsibility of the leaders. And they blame the European Union for all the bad things, and it's the bad Europeans, it's this vague tyranny of technocrats deciding, and then all the good things, they take the credit for it. So I think if we need to call someone out for this issue, it should be the leaders in every single member state of the European Union who have the mandate and the responsibility and the legitimization by the voters to make decisions. They should make decisions. It's as simple as that.
They make them at the European Council level.
Yes, and this is what I'm saying. You cannot just blame the Commission for everything.
It's a difference.
I would like to come into this, if I may. Yeah. So in defense of the European Union, I guess I'm also full disclosure. I'm a professor of political economy, teaching at a degree on the political economy of Europe at the European Institute in LSE. So vested interest, I guess. I mean, let's clarify this thing about the cucumbers. The cucumbers, the kernels of the cucumbers was about consumer protection and product standardization. It was an extreme. It was taken away in 2009, so it doesn't apply anymore. So what remains is a lot of regulation about health and safety, about genetically modified products, crops, and so forth. So this is about protection. I mean, people can have a preference for protection or against protection, but on balance, the Council ratifies, or the national parliaments ratify EU directives, EU decisions. So it seems like the people, or to the extent that parliaments represent the people, like protection, or we like protection in Europe more than in the US. So, for example, should there be a warning about the sugar content on soft drinks? Well, I think most Europeans would say yes, it would be quite nice to have this information. So that's one thing about the European Union. The other thing about the European Union, of course, is that there's big things. Increasingly, there's big things that national states, nation states, and especially small states cannot deal with. You have a pandemic. You can coordinate as much as you want your national policy, but you won't deal with the pandemic. We have the war in Ukraine, the destabilization in the Middle East. We have technological AI developments. You cannot deal with that. Now, if you think you can deal with that at national level, then of course, you can try. But most people in the, I think, in the policy making and academic world dealing with these issues, they're calling for more coordination. And then you can think, okay, what is the best coordination forum? One coordination forum is I speak with my friends. I mean, Orban and Putin do that. It's a coordination, an ad hoc coordination forum. Another coordination forum is the United Nations. But we know there's huge veto points in the United Nations, there's no socialization, countries, there's a lot of kind of meetings in the corridors and arm twisting for specific countries to vote in a particular way or another. And then a third model could be the European Union. There's a form of socialization, we learn from each other, we collaborate, we feel we have some sort of allegiance to each other, and we form policies together. So I think, if one has a first best in their mind, which is the ideal level of policy making, I understand, maybe the minimum wage should not be coordinated at the national level, it is something that should be decentralized. But if one thinks that we have a big challenge ahead, like climate change, the multipolarity of the global system, and so forth, then we need to coordinate. And one way of dealing with the big problems is making people believe that, the political system is for them. So the European minimum wage, the directive for the European minimum wage is not called the European minimum wage. It's called a directive for an adequate wage in Europe. So if people take issue with the proposition of an adequate wage in Europe, then of course we will have a problem with that. But I think this is very important to clarify. The alternative is not the textbook ideal world situation. The alternative is that you have to deal alone with climate change, with destabilization by different geopolitical forces, Russia, China, what have you, and with the technological disruptions that we do not even understand, let alone be the knowledge of how to exploit them. So that was my 2-minute defense of the European Union. Thank you.
Okay, Gregoris, your speaker.
Yes. I think that the European Union is an issue, obviously, and there is a legitimacy, there is a democratic deficit, the question of legitimacy, but I wouldn't consider that the crisis of democracy in European countries. I think that the problem is much deeper, and it has to do with the limited participation of the citizens into the policy-making process, the distancing from the mass parties, or the different relationship they have with politicians. So whatever problems we have at Europe and European Union level, I think we can find them at the level of the nation state as well. We were talking about democratic, where is the legitimacy of the European Commission? Well, where is the legitimacy of the government that has been elected with 30% of the vote, for example, in one nation state, and so on. I want to comment briefly on a point made by the audience, somebody from the audience, about housing inflation. I think it's a very key thing that sometimes gets ignored or is not counted in the statistics that measure income inequality and inequality in society and so on. Housing inflation is part of the overall picture, and we should not just see the wage or the income in isolation, but we need to see those in just in relation to the cost of living. But within that cost of living, it's not just goods and services, it's also housing, which is increasingly a big problem. And a final point, again mentioned by the audience, about migration. Well, it was also mentioned by the speakers about the integration, or the lack of integration. So, well, I think we're talking about migration. We need to have in mind 3 different things that structure. One is global inequality, inequality of wealth across the planet. Then there's labor shortages in the developed economies, and that's what drives migration, right? So there are jobs here that want workers. We've seen that in the UK, where we are based now. There was Brexit. One of the key arguments for Brexit was that we don't want Eastern Europeans here. Well, somebody needs to do the jobs. So you ended up having more non-Europeans after all, because the jobs need to be done if the economy is to function. So the problem comes not migration in general, it's about the exploitative conditions with which migration takes place. Why do we tolerate exploitation? And if that's restricted to migrants and so on. And questions of law enforcement and so on. And that's where the far right comes in, because the far right attacks the most vulnerable people instead of who actually need the protection of society. That's it.
I think 2 points that are relevant in the book Why Nations Fail, written by the 2 Nobel Prize winners, is institutions, which is probably the constant we are looking for. And the other point is nations, because of weak institutions, fall into a vicious circle, and the question is how to reverse that. So you have strong institutions directing and pushing voters towards the right direction, then voters in their turn push the politicians and the institutions to further improve or become further corrupt, and that's why nations fail or succeed.
Just something. I think the comment about
Migration was about illegal migration. And when I was a minister, I was actually in favor of giving more permits to satisfy the needs of the economy. And unfortunately, the new government is stricter, contrary to the needs of the economy. But I think that our comment, the question, correct me if I'm wrong, was about illegal migration.
No, in general.
In general.
In general.
Then I agree also.
Clarify.
Elena Constantino. Just listening to the very interesting discussion from a political perspective, economic perspective, an image came to mind from physics, chaos. Too many parameters, too many unknowns, too many relations between the parameters we are not aware of. So going back to the title of the event, I would like to hear your views about the future over the next couple of years. How do you foresee things will develop politically and economically? Thank you.
The world we live in is very, very complicated. You're right. And in the past, it was like very easy to evaluate situations in binary notions, good and bad, black and white, etc., etc. Then we started, seeing the world maybe a bit more complicated, using algebraic quadratic equations, yeah, and just saying it's a lot of factors with different weights, and we're analyzing that. Now it's become crazy. We need to use matrices to translate or understand the world. So how do we make sense of it? I always use Occam's razor. Go back to the principles. Simplify the equations. Simplify what we've got. And the complicated usually has very clear answers when you look at it, going back to a principled stance. And what do I mean? I mean democracy. Let's not sanctify it. This is the point I was trying to make before. It has flaws. It's always had flaws. People invented it and reinvented it in many ways. Personally, I do not think it will go away, but maybe it will not. In 100 years from now, it may exist in different forms. But it's been around since forever. So I have hope. Now, the second point, which is important about democracy in the future, I'm glad that we have stopped this nonsense in my mind of exporting democracy everywhere. One cup does not fit all. And after the end of the Cold War, we had Fukuyama writing about the end of history, and it's done, it's a done deal, it's the liberal market, and it's a democratic model, and everybody, the Americans are saying, wow, everybody wants to be like us. And we began, as the West, forcing people to be free, quote unquote. And that didn't work. And if you look at, for example, at the Arab Spring, did it really help the Middle East? Or did it make the Middle East more of a mess? Question mark. So, we have to be specific, but general at the same time. Specific when it comes to us and understand that it's okay for democracy to develop in different forms, in forms which we may not understand at this point. But we cannot generalize it and want everyone to be like us. And it has created, I think, more trouble than it helped. And it has been a very expensive experiment if we look, for example, at Afghanistan. So some food for thought.
Thank you very much. Hello, Gregoris, Metropolitan speaking. I just wanted also to say hello to you, also to do well. One thing that Demetris said about Archimoglu and Robinson, it's important to see about the quality of institutions, whether it is the government that is determining the winners and losers. And I have two examples only to say on this, the low corporate tax scheme and the passport scheme. So take these two and think about the quality of our institutions. Now, I have a question though. There is a lot of debate about our two academics, please, whether we are in a cycle. And they are talking whether there is a cycle of good times and we are moving to a cycle of bad times because of more political extremism, people feel entitled, they are asking for more and more, they lose their trust to institutions, they are even willing to attack the institutions instead of defending them. In a normal country, they should be defending the institutions. Do you share these cycle theories, or is it something that makes nice pop science, or for us to read? Do they have any substance, or is the world not such a simple place? Thank you.
Anyone? Comments?
So I'll say something I had said. I couldn't fully hear, the sound was not as clear, but if I understand, we're talking about sort of political cycles, ground political cycles in terms of like shifts to the left and the right, to the center and to extremism, if that was the question, if I understood correctly. Yeah?
Sorry, I meant if there are cycles of movement from good times, let's say peace, prosperity, extremism, wars, etc. This is becoming very popular theme, and extremism is one of the steps, let's say, before wider conflicts within societies and between societies.
I mean, there's as many theories as people on the linearity of history of the cycles and so forth. But of course, there are economic cycles, for example, and the short-term economic cycles and the long duration, long to the economic cycles, and likewise, we say also perhaps with the political. But I think not criticizing any different view on cycles or linearities and so forth. I think where the mindset inevitably goes is that we left a period what we call the Great Moderation, and then we were thinking we're going into secular stagnation. The Great Moderation being a period where things were kind of reasonably easy, and there was a reasonably stable growth and some distribution. And then we thought, okay, productivity growth has ended. The secular stagnation, and before we established this as a threat, then we had what we now call poly-crisis. And I think inevitably, that would have to be the thing. You know, you cannot see, you know, the threats that come with, definitely with climate change as cyclical. You cannot say that, well, you know, it will go, technology will adapt, and then, you know, we'll reach another equilibrium, and then 100 years later, you know, we cannot afford to take the risk on seeing climate change as cyclical. We cannot also take the risk of thinking, well, you know, the pencil replaced some people in the ancient Egypt or whatever, you know, like, and then the computer replaced some people in the offices in the 70s and the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, and then, you know, the internet displaced some other people, but then this comes with cycles, new cohorts come, they acquire new skills, they get jobs. We cannot say the same with AI, okay? There is a possibility, maybe it's very small, but it is a real possibility that it will create a future of non-employment for cognitive skills, yeah? And then we have to think about it, you know, maybe how we regulate AI, or definitely what we do if that future materializes, you know? How can we organize a society where employment is not the main thing, okay? And everybody probably has to live on a minimum income, which may be very generous or not, and so forth. So what I'm saying, you know, and I would say the same for pandemics, you know, the rise of multipolarity in geopolitics and so forth. I think we cannot afford to assume that these things are cyclical. Of course, there's good times and bad times. There will be times where the international environment will be such that it will allow for more collaboration between states than not. But I think the criticality of the challenges we face necessitates that we see them as a linear thing that goes from good to bad, and then we have to deal with that. And if it turns out to be cyclical, maybe we unnecessarily spend too much effort, but that's better than to realize the opposite, that we didn't put the effort and then we kind of lost.
I think we have time for one, maybe two questions. Sorry.
Just as Gregory was referring to earlier, I think the future of global economic welfare depends on large numbers of people, and the demographics suggest large numbers of people have to move from Africa and Asia to the rest of the world, to the industrial world, and people of a different color and a different religion in many cases. And for that to be compatible with social stability, you need an intelligent policy. And to my mind, there is no trace of a discussion. The Spanish Prime Minister made some noises in terms of having a more liberal policy. You know, some years ago, the two gentlemen from the UK will remember, and others here who are sort of our age will remember Enoch Powell talking about rivers of blood, telling people in the UK that if they are not careful and they let a lot of people come in, there will be a lot of blood on the streets. He was ostracized. Now people are saying the same thing, and they are members of legitimate parties. In fact, the Labour Party is beyond recognition in that area. So my question is, what will it take to deal with this global issue, with it together with climate change, is probably the paramount global issue that requires a global solution. What will it take? Because we are not getting leadership. It is true, as Constantinos says, that reasonable people, our friends, people we talk every day, will vote the way that 22% voted in Sweden, and because those are the messages they are getting. I am worried that this debate is not taking place.
And Gregoris, I think you had something to say.
Yes, I think to answer this question on the cycles, which is an interesting one but very difficult one to answer. In my view, coming from a history background, I would be inclined more to view that in terms of historical eras or epochs. And it's not so much a question of good and bad times, but there can be some characteristics which we can use to generalize. And for example, economic policy would be one, the political system, the dominant forms of beliefs about the economy, about politics, and so on. If we take that as our criteria, we can, I think, distinguish into three different eras. There was since the Second World War. So we have the golden years of the 50s and 60s and 70s, or the Keynesian times. And then there's a shift in the 70s. In the late 70s, there's a shift to the neoliberal times. And that takes at least 3 decades, where there is a shift that is historically formed. And it changes not just the economics and not just how economy is governed, but it also changes how we understand the economy, how we understand states and markets and politics and parties and individuals and trade unions and so on. So that's a complete change in historical sense, and that's the neoliberal era in my analysis, which collapses effectively with the economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, and we are now in a sort of period where it was followed, the economic crisis was followed by the pandemic crisis, and we have nothing, no solid framework. We can use different names: post-neoliberal, post-global crisis, poly-crisis, and so on. We don't have a name for it. But I believe that there are signs in the last decade, more than a decade, that we are shifting away from what was the case in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And the point is very important. It's not just the labor shortages; it's also the demographics that are driving migration, and that Europe, the developed world, especially Europe, but not just Europe, is aging, and already the migrants are needed to maintain the social security systems and the pension system and so on. And it's not just a global climate crisis that it's in parallel with the migration crisis; they are also interconnected. A lot of the global climate crisis produces new waves of migrants already, and that will be accelerating in the next years. I mean, I don't have answers. I wish I did, but I agree with that migration is here to stay, and that what is needed is to find ways to ensure that it happens in a way that respects human rights and benefits society as a whole.
We're running out of time, so I'll give you 30 seconds each maximum to wrap up final comments before I thank you, and then we'll move for coffee and continue the discussion.
Just one last word as food for thought. We haven't talked about climate change and how it affects democracy. We've talked about migration, but climate change causes conflict. Conflict causes migration. Migration causes domestic unrest and adherence to extremism. Food for thought. I was reading something today, which it sort of occurred to me as something very interesting and quite scary. How will the people who have been affected by the natural disaster in the States vote in a few days from now? Big question. Remember that 537 votes in Florida determined the election back then. It was Bush and Gore, I think, wasn't it? So where are they going to vote? Who is going to vote? Will that change the course of the American election? So what happens if Trump gets elected? What will happen to democracies in Europe? Security-wise, democracy-wise, what will happen to the American democracy? Thank you.
Yes, very, very, very briefly, I think that we are entering a new economic era in the next years. I think that geopolitical and security concerns are becoming more relevant than ever. We are seeing reverse that trend of globalization that produced so many benefits to the society and to the world in general. We see that being reversed right now. Actually, Trump, Biden have similar politics regarding the economic politics with Bernie Sanders, who was considered to be an extremist by some. So I think this is very, very dangerous. And it's for the first time I see those security concerns, trade wars, fundamentalism against into the big picture becoming so relevant. I think also the international financial system is becoming geopoliticized. We see sanctions entering into the equation. We see efforts to make new currencies. So we have to adopt to that. But we also have to realize certain things. We have to realize that within this era, we have to rethink our approach towards migration. And I respect what Mihalis said, finding a smart way. There is no smart way. Thanks.
Gregoris, final words, final thoughts?
I don't have anything else.
Okay, fair enough, no problem. Vassilis?
I must say, I thought maybe it's about to close with the question of the revolutionary form or ruin, and I'll just sort of use my position as the last person in the panel to draw my conclusion on it. I think very unlikely that we'll have successful revolutions because there's no constants to unify the revolutionary body as headed. Ruin is a bit of definitely to be dismissed as universally undesirable. So the only way is reform, and then we go back to what we always knew. Even in good times, conferences were organized to talk about reforms. So that's what we have to do. It's just that we have to figure out what exactly we need to reform this time, not only how to reform it. So that would be my overall conclusion.
Okay, while thanking our speakers, KPMG and no, I'm not saying anything. I thought he said he had Anyway, to avoid any dangerous crowds, I leave you with Winston Churchill's words: democracy is the worst for governments, settle on the others. Anyway, thank you very much.